Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of our series and our walk through the Bible one book, one verse at a time. Today we're looking at the very short book of Obadiah. Now, the book of Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament, and it's a prophecy against the kingdom of Edom. If you remember, Edom was set up by the descendants of Esau, and so this traces all the way back to Jacob and Esau when Jacob stole the birthright, when the blessing was placed on him, and then that family was split. And Esau went away, and Jacob continued on to do his own things. And Edom became a very powerful, influential, and rich nation that sat in the mountains. And it became very sure of itself, very confident in its own power, and that it would never be overrun. It was so confident that when Babylon came and destroyed Israel and Jerusalem and took them into captivity, people from Edom joined in the looting. They went up after the destruction and they destroyed the city, took whatever they could. They would catch fugitives who had escaped from Babylon and from Nebuchadnezzar. They would capture them and sell them on to Babylon. And rightly so, Obadiah is angry, and he says God is angry with Edom. Naturally so, in some ways this comes from a sense of anger in Obadiah over Edom, but it's also a principle where when we live a life of betrayal, where we live a life where we go against what God wants for us, eventually those things catch up to us in certain ways, and we usually experience some kind of betrayal if we have betrayed others in other ways. If we run a business where we are loose with our deals and we don't always live up to our commitments, usually at some point others are going to do the same thing back to us, and we're going to get burned by some of our own techniques. I mean, these things happen in families too. If we betray others, then often it comes back to haunt us in certain ways. And this is one of the natural consequences of sin, you might say. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between natural consequences and consequences that, say, God brings that are special consequences for what happens. But in this particularly, it seems that there's a mixture of both. And this is going to happen because it's a natural consequence of the way that they lived and because God is going to make sure that it happens. This comes from Obadiah verse 15, rather. The day of the Lord is near for all nations, when God comes and sets things right. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. I think this is good for us to remember, that we don't get away with things. And even though there is grace and there is forgiveness, sometimes we still have to suffer the consequences that we experience because of things that we had done. And even though this book does end with a promise that Judah will be restored again, it's one of those harder books to read. It's a book that foretells destruction and the elimination of a people group, and doesn't necessarily say that it's going to be done through genocide or something like that, but it simply prophesies that this will happen because of what they have done in the past. And it's hard to read, and sometimes it's hard to justify or to connect with some of the New Testament things where we see, and even a lot of the Old Testament promises of grace and forgiveness and renewal. But it's a reminder, particularly here in Obadiah, it's a reminder that God opposes the proud, but he lifts up the humble. And this is a principle we see throughout the Bible. And when we admit the things that we have done and the ways that we are trying to rule and live our own life, when we let go of that confidence that we know that we have done things right and that we can do whatever we want to do, which we know is not true anyway. When we let go of that, admit that we've done wrong, ask for forgiveness, God restores us and reinstates us. God says this is an example here in Edom where people do not humble themselves. They refuse to admit that they have done wrong, and they think that they can save themselves.